Women's health in history was absolutely crazy. We're talking hysteria, melancholy. There's a lot of wacky stuff. Let's talk about it. Hysteria in particular translates to womb disease with a range of symptoms that included anxiety, sleeplessness, irritability, nervousness, some naughtiness, sensations of heaviness, lower pelvic situations, and a lot of other weirdness. This is all according to the technology of women. The ailment was treated by physicians or midwives, who applied a massage to a certain area to women suffering from it. Yes, this was largely a disease for women of a certain class. White women who suffered the type of hysteria that we would now classify as a prolapsed uterine lining or diseased ovaries were seen as endangering the race through their low fertility. But hey, at least we got forms of self-pleasure out of this. Devices like that became a mainstay in doctors' offices near the end of the 19th century, and now they're a little more common. One of the silliest medical ailments women have been warned about throughout time was bicycle face. So, when the bicycle became very popular, women were cautioned that the awkward faces people make while attempting to ride a bike would make them ugly, and that would be the end of the world. Perhaps that was because, in addition to just being all-around good methods of transportation, bicycles were tools of feminism that made women mobile for longer distances without the reliance on a man. As history points out, suffragettes were early adopters of the bicycle, and using it pushed dress reform, as it was nearly impossible to wear any kind of restrictive outfit or bustle while pushing a bike. The backlash from male doctors in particular led to a laundry list of health problems that only female riders would surely experience. Headaches, depression, exhaustion, insomnia, heart palpitations, and of course, the worst of it all, bicycle face. Fortunately, the theories largely disappeared a few years after the adaptation of the bicycle, once nobody was truly able to be diagnosed with having an ugly face, thanks to just a bike. During the times of the ancient Greeks, many women had to watch out for the mystery of the traveling uterus. Even Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, shared his concerns with what early physician Aristeas of Cappadocia described as an animal within an animal that rattled around a woman's body and supposedly affected her moods and health. One of the prescriptions for the wandering womb was frequent pregnancy, because the animal was moving out of sheer boredom. One physician proposed shouting at a woman or making her sneeze to keep said womb in place. By the 17th century, experts believed a wandering womb could be lured back into position with pleasant smells applied to a woman's lower region. Eventually, this ailment seemed archaic to medical practitioners, but hysteria, which evolved from this, didn't. By 1872 in England and Wales, women made up the majority of certified lunatics, which was the medical term back then, and these folks were confined to asylums. In a society that not only perceived women as youth-like, irrational, and unstable, but also rendered them legally powerless and economically marginal, it's not surprising that doctors were quick to diagnose women as so-called loons. The Guardian's Gary Nunn traces the origin of the term lunacy from a monthly periodic insanity, believed to be triggered by the moon cycle. So maybe, perhaps, you can guess where this lunacy came from. The first ever lobotomy was performed on a Kansas housewife back in 1936, and the psychiatrist who prescribed the operation, one Walter Freeman, reportedly believed that an overload of emotions led to this mysterious mental illness, and that the only cure was getting rid of certain nerves in the brain to stabilize a person's mental health. Well, a woman's mental health. And often, lobotomy patients, most of them, were all just women whose emotions needed to be checked. Notably, a British woman by the name of Eileen Davey experienced postpartum depression after giving birth to her second offspring in 1946. Well, her husband, who was required to sign the consent form for his wife's procedure by the way, said that he was told the procedure would be no more serious than just getting a tooth yanked. Afterwards, somehow, mysteriously, his wife was irreversibly damaged. Wonder why? The doctor who performed this, Freeman, performed thousands of surgeries before being banned from operating. As many as 50,000 estimated lobotomies were performed in the United States by the early 1950s, even though some countries like Germany and Japan outlawed the practice. Meanwhile, Sweden also largely adopted the procedure, and about 63% of these operations were performed on women. Even one of the most amazing painters throughout history, who was one of the leading artists credited with bringing modernism to Sweden, died after a botched lobotomy to treat her mental illness in 1948. The vapors are understood these days as something that required a Victorian morning fainting couch, but when the term was coined, it could mean anything from PMS to clinical depression. It may also have meant hypochondria, but generally we would understand the vapors as anxiety. According to the late New York Times language columnist William Safire, the vapors were described as a disease of nervous disability in which strange images seem to float hazily before the eyes or appear as if real. During the Victorian period, well into the 1920s, women were especially seen as weak. This was a common ailment among suffragettes, with the prescription being rest and maybe some smelling salts. Slightly over a century ago, poison was a common part of everyday life. Arsenic, the notorious metalloid, was used in a lot of things, primarily in the inks and dyes of beautifully printed wallpapers and clothing. Odorless and colorless, it went into food as food coloring, and it was used in beauty products such as arsenic complexion wafers that promised women pure white skin, and this happened until like the 1920s. The literature of the era hints at the effects from said poisoning. The main character in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper for instance, descends into madness and believes that the source of her illness stems from the wallpaper in her room. It makes me think of all the yellow things I ever saw. Not beautiful ones like buttercups, but old, foul, bad yellow things. But there is something else about that paper, the smell. Because it dyed fabric bright green, arsenic also ended up in dresses, gloves, shoes, and artificial flower wreaths that women used to decorate their hair and clothes. The wreaths in particular could cause rashes for anybody who wore them. Also, but hey, like mercury hats, arsenic fashions were most dangerous for the people who manufactured them. For example, in 1861, an artificial flower maker named Matilda Schurer, whose job involved dusting flowers with green, arsenic-laced powder, died a violent and colorful death. She convulsed, foamed at the mouth, everything came up, and everything that came up was green. Ditto for fingernails, the whites of her eyes. An autopsy found arsenic in her stomach, her liver, and her lungs. Articles about her death and the plight of artificial flower makers raised public awareness about arsenic being kinda bad. The British Medical Journal wrote that the arsenic-wearing woman carries in her skirts enough poison to slay the whole of the admirers she may meet within half a dozen ballrooms. So in the mid to late 1800s, finally the public started to be like, we don't need this green. Also, arsenic was used in medical tonics, because in tiny amounts, arsenic stimulates the crucially important red bodily fluids, hence its use in leukemia treatments today. Turner syndrome is a condition that affects only females, and it results when one of the X chromosomes is missing or partially missing. The loss or alteration of said chromosome occurs randomly. Sometimes it's because of a problem with the sperm or the egg, and the other times the loss or alteration of the X chromosome happens early in development. Turner syndrome can cause a variety of medical and developmental problems, including short height, failure of the ovaries to develop, and heart defects. Signs and symptoms of this are going to vary among girls and women with the disorder. For some folks, the presence of Turner syndrome might not be readily apparent, but in other ones, several physical features are apparent early. So if they are subtle, like maybe you just get like a heart defect, which will develop slowly over time. But the most common signs in almost all the girls that have it are that short stature and the ovarian insufficiency due to ovarian failure. Sometimes this is diagnosed prenatally. Sometimes it's during the early years of life. Occasionally, if you've got like mild signs and symptoms, you don't find out till later in life. Good luck. Rett syndrome is a rare genetic neurological disorder that occurs almost exclusively in girls. It leads to severe impairments, affecting nearly every aspect of a young human's life. Their ability to speak, walk, eat, even breathe easily. The hallmark of Rett syndrome is near constant repetitive hand movements. Don't look at me. It is usually recognized when folks begin to miss developmental milestones or lose abilities they had gained, such as the ability to crawl, walk, communicate, or even use their hands. Over time, folks with this have increasing problems with any muscle, any controlling of movement, any coordination, communication. It can also cause seizures and intellectual disabilities. Going back to those hand movements, you can get like repetitive rubbing or clapping, which would replace any kind of useful usage of hands. Although there's no cure, potential treatments are being studied. Current treatment focuses on improving movement, communication, treating seizures, and familial support. Finally for today, cervical cancer is the fourth most common cancer in women globally, with around 660,000 new cases and around 350,000 deaths back in 2022. This is not a new disease. The history of how it was experienced, viewed, and managed in the past has been studied as a part of women's history and the overall history of medicine and gynecology. It's a cancer arising from the cervix cervix, or really in any layer of the wall of said cervix. And it's thanks to the abnormal growth of cells that have the ability to invade or spread to other parts of the body. Early on, you don't really see a lot of symptoms, but then you might get some abnormal loss of red fluids, pelvic pain, or pain during intercourse. Back in the early 1900s, this was one of the leading causes of death in women in the US, with more than 40,000 deaths each year. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. See y'all next time.